Ok, listo.
Buenas tardes, buenos días, buenas noches a todos los podescuchas con una nueva edición, una edición muy especial de Contraélite en inglés con un gran invitado que nos saluda desde, bueno, América del Norte, sí, pero Canadá. Entonces, Vanessa va a hacer la presentación en inglés y si les gusta este material y lo encuentran de provecho, por favor, escríbanos en los comentarios y trataremos de invitar otros invitados que también hablen, no sé, francés, italiano, ruso, alemán o también en inglés. Entonces esperemos que les guste esta edición especial de Contraelite. Vanessa.
Hello, everyone. This is a special edition of Contraelite. We are doing it in English for the first time. Usually our show is in Spanish, but it's good to get all sorts of voices, and we're not going to let language be a barrier. So, with us today, we have, oh my God, I'm probably going to have to do this one more time because I don't have the full name for our guest.
Jay Watts.
Jay, because I was like, Jay Watts. Okay, I'm so sorry. Okay, one more time. Okay, so today we have a special guest who is coming to our show from North America, specifically Canada. His name is Jay Watts, and he is the central organizer for the Communist Party of Canada, and he is also the coordinator for the Toronto Association for Peace and Solidarity. We are very excited to have you on our first English version show of Contraelite. So, welcome, Jay.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here and talk to you guys.
Perfect. Very good.
Okay, so as things are ongoing and unfolding in Belarus right now, you probably heard of the situation with Lukashenko and the opposition. I don't know if the Communist Party of Canada or you personally have some kind of feeling, just before we get into the main discussion, what are your thoughts from the Communist Party of Canada perspective?
Right now we haven't put anything out. We're just kind of watching things as they unfold. I mean, there's obviously sort of suspicions about what NATO's doing in the United States. Anytime anything happens on Russia's border in the last many decades, but most recently the last decade, we see the encirclement of Russia as being one of the main focuses of NATO and the Anglo-American imperialist bloc. So that's not to say that there's not substantial issues with the Belarusian government either. But right now we don't have any official statement. We're just kind of watching things as they unfold to see what the direction it's heading in.
Okay, good. So now we're going to go into the main discussion. There is a very interesting article, which is one that mainly concerns us, that it was written by, I believe, it's one of the most important intellectuals from the left, and there are not that many in Canada, is Yves Engler. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. And he wrote an article on the website CanadianDimension.com. We'll put the link on our description. Talking about the treatment of Venezuela shows Canada is long overdue for a foreign policy restart. And he just goes into describing how the Canadian government, the political leadership on both parties have been really pushing even a bit more vocally than the US, not only with sanctions, but really being at the forefront in terms of PR. The Lima Group, many people don't know that, but Canada has been really the main organizer of the Lima Group, really pushing hard for regime change in Venezuela. So I just wanted to take your perspective on this little known fact that Canada is really, I don't know, the junior partner of imperialism in the North American dimension. How I believe your voice is very critical, but I don't know how really known this is in the Canadian mainstream. How about Canada being really the junior partner of imperialism towards Venezuela?
It's relatively known. I think whether it's thought of as a bad thing is unfortunately not the case. It's well known just because there's been an aggressive change in the foreign policy of the Liberal Party of Canada. Historically, in the past, it's charted what is seemingly more independent foreign policy. I don't think that's entirely true. I think that in many ways it was still and always has been the junior partner to American imperialism. And also our understanding is that Canada is an imperialist country with its own interests as well. But it was a little more circumspect about how it acted. So, for example, in 2003, Jean Chrétien, who was the Liberal Prime Minister of Canada at the time, didn't actively join the coalition of the willing or whatever it was that Bush had in the invasion of Iraq. And so didn't actively participate, but instead played a behind-the-scenes role. There was still military support in that, but on the surface of it, it seemed that Canada wasn't actively engaged. There's a very sharp change in this new Liberal administration. We think that one of the turning points initially when Trudeau won election was Stéphane Dion, who was the foreign affairs minister. About a year in, he was turfed, and Chrystia Freeland, who is now the deputy prime minister, was made the head of foreign affairs. She is traditionally, well, I mean, members of our party found this out too. She's the descendant of a Nazi collaborator, and okay, you can't pin the sins of the grandfather on her. However, she's said that he is a very important influence on her politically. She knew of the fact that he was a Nazi collaborator. She sort of lied about it as she was developing her political career, and still called him like a big influence on her politics and that. She's been traditionally hostile to the Russians probably because of her family experience. And so when she took office as the foreign affairs minister, when she was shuffled into that position, we saw a drastic change in Canadian foreign policy to a more aggressive stance. In some ways, even more aggressive than the Conservative government that was before under Stephen Harper. So one of the things that I found, and that's I think Ben Norton at the website Grey Zone has published about it. When she came in office, the U.S. State Department, the ambassador in Ottawa, sent a note to the U.S. State Department and said that Canada was adopting an American first foreign policy with Chrystia Freeland, and that's exactly what's happened. I mean, the Lima Group is sort of a little known, is more well known in Canada. I don't think it's talked about too much in the U.S. because they have Elliott Abrams, who's sort of taking the lead there with Juan Guaido, sorry. But yeah, so she's definitely leading that effort, and with some of the most horrific governments in Latin America. I mean, the government of Bolsonaro in Brazil, the Colombian government, but we also see in other places too. For example, there was a smaller organization called the Vancouver Group that met a couple of years ago, and that was specifically to try to institute a naval blockade on on North Korea, the DPRK. She was at the forefront of that. She's also led to the sanctions, the Magnitsky Law sanctions here that we have in Canada on Russian people. She's aggressive towards China. So in many ways, I think Yves, when he wrote that piece, was responding to something that happened. Basically, there was a UN Security Council seat open. It was sort of one of the temporary ones that rotates. And there was 3 countries in line for it, Norway, Ireland, and Canada. Eventually, it didn't go to Canada, which we think is a very good thing. Norway and Ireland have their problems as well, but they're not as aggressive as Canada is. The one novel thing about that situation was actually there was a significant group of people, peace activists, trade unionists, and others, who organized a campaign to work against the Canadian government having that seat. I mean, you didn't have anything like that in Norway and Ireland. Unfortunately, that hasn't led to a rethink in Canadian foreign policy at all, when it should. The most recent thing that they did was make Bob Rae, who's a former NDP, the Social Democratic Party here, a premier of Ontario, who went into the Liberals and is a very close friend of Chrystia Freeland. He's now the ambassador at the UN. He's also very hawkish. He supports Zionist Israel. So I don't know. That's the situation. So it is somewhat known in Canada what they're doing, but there's also a level of propaganda here against Venezuela that makes a lot of Canadians feel like it's okay, like it's some sort of a humanitarian mission, instead of what it actually is, which is an imperialist attempt to control Venezuela. We think specifically Canadian imperialist interests there are not just to serve the United States, of course that helps, but also, gold mining. There's a significant amount of gold in Venezuela and other interests for Canadian mining corporations.
It's just so, thank you so much for that really outline of everything. I mean, I think I'm almost at a loss for words and questions, because I think you just outlined everything that I wanted to discuss. And it's so refreshing that to hear a well-informed voice from the Canadian perspective, especially the viciousness of Chrystia Freeland. I mean, everything you said, I completely agree. And it's kind of reminiscent to the role that Condoleezza Rice was playing in 2003, 2004 with Bush. He's really vicious, and it gives really ammunition to a lot of Latin American right wing and also the Venezuelan opposition, the violent one, that, oh, it's not just Trump, because it's problematic for them to associate so closely with Trump, but look at Canada, Justin Trudeau, liberal, they're, like a Polish, pretty face. And in reality, the background is horrible. And like you said, just mining interests and all of these corporations. Vanessa, I don't know if you had something to add about this.
Yeah, no, I really appreciated, Jay, that entire contextualization of the role of Canada in imperialism, and I think we had a guest a few months ago who was talking about the role of media, but then he also talked about the role of the West. Like, we always just focus on, oh, the US is the imperialist force, but it's actually this entire block of countries that are pushing for the same kinds of interests, to invade, to colonize, to extract, and usually it's the US that really bears the brunt of it, and then other countries such as Canada are kind of like angelized, and they're like, oh, but if even this other country is condemning that situation, then it must be really bad. And it's kind of like saving face for these terrible things that are happening around the world. Or for example, like here when we had the Keystone pipeline protests and all these different things that were, the American government was being absolutely brutal with Native people here who were rightly protesting and protecting water. Nobody really looked at what Canada was doing with their First Nations and the role that they were playing as far as those pipelines that they are wanting, and those projects that they want to move forward, and how that position very much aligned with this, like, oh, the evil Trump position. But it's like, okay, but like, excuse me, Canada's basically doing the same. It just has better PR, and or it's not as, I don't know, inflammatory, or people will not believe you if you say, well, okay, what if you look at Canada, or what about all of these things that they have been also involved in? So I think it's really incredible, and it's interesting that because right now we're living under Trump here in the US, Canada seems like a paradise, like absolutely a paradise. And yesterday I was talking to some friends, and they were, one of them was like really upset, and he was like, whatever, like, I'm gonna renounce my American citizenship, I'm just gonna go to Canada and blah blah blah. And like, to me, it's like, I mean, I'm conflicted about it, because it took me like 20 years to become an American citizen, and like a lot of money, and it was like a really long path to citizenship, and like, I come from like a lot of privilege, so that just kind of like didn't sit right with me. Also because it's like, people think that they can just like up and leave and immigrate, and I'm like, okay, yeah, it's not that easy. And then secondly, it's like, okay, but like, look at, like, Canada has like serious issues. It's just that, I always hear this meme. It's like, or see this meme rather, of Canadians are basically, the person living in an apartment building, and they're the person that's living above like the meth lab. And it's like, yeah, okay, like, at least we're not the meth lab, but it's like, well, I don't know. You guys are not a meth lab, but in this analogy, but there's some pretty serious stuff going on there too that we cannot just let go. And just going back to what one of our guests in the last in a past episode was talking about, it is this entire block of Western countries that will align whenever possible. And it was reflected in this alignment of these 50 or so countries that, just fell in line to say, yep, Juan Guaido is the president of Venezuela, and that's what's going to happen, and we're going to accept their ambassadors. And it was an embarrassment, actually, to see that happening. But people say, oh, because the U.S. Just like, well, we cannot just exempt from responsibility all these other countries too.
No, of course not. And I think also one of the reasons why Canada is maybe playing this role internationally is because I think for many people in the imperialist bloc, Donald Trump is not necessarily a reliable imperialist. He's 100% awful. He does horrible things. He is also guiding the world towards war. But sometimes he decides that he doesn't want to pay attention to Venezuela, or maybe he's going to be a little more erratic about DPRK. And for a lot of people, I think especially in the NATO bloc, that's they don't know if they can entirely trust it. So to have somebody like Canada that has a better reputation internationally, totally undeserved, as you mentioned, that's a really important role for them to play. I think that's funny about the meth lab thing. I mean, in some ways, okay, it's true. Yes, the United States is in a bad situation, but it's also if you remove that meth lab, or the person above the meth lab moves somewhere else, it would be pretty apparent how horrific that other tenant is. I don't like Canada is sort of exempt because of this situation, and a lot of Canadians too look down their nose at the United States and say, "Well, at least we're not that." But I don't think that's a very progressive or beneficial way for people in Canada or people internationally to look at us, just because we're not as bad as that. Well, we're not as large as the United States either. And even when it comes in towards racism, whether it's the police shooting Indigenous or Black people in Canada, the rates are actually relatively similar. Certainly for incarceration too. We don't have it's not as large in terms of a percentage, but it's there's a racial element to our incarceration here, to police violence. Domestically, there are just as many horrific social problems here as there are in the United States, I'd say.
But don't you think at the same time, Jay, that, I mean, there is this, I don't know why, but it's very powerful. I'm sure you're familiar with Michael Moore's documentaries, and he kind of constantly paint this idyllic picture of Canada. You are completely disagreeing with this. Because, again, going back to the article, it just doesn't seem a Justin Trudeau thing. It just goes back decades, and Stephen Harper was also horrible. He was kind of like George W. Bush, but from Canada. And also the Haitian situation with Aristide. Canada played awful role in that really horrible situation. So I just wonder how do they get away with that? And also, what are the main problems that Canada is facing right now internally in terms of being that junior partner of the US in the foreign policy aspect?
So I think the reason Canada gets away with it is just what I mentioned before, the sort of internal Canadian idea that we're better than the US. And also, when it comes to international things, there's this idea that the peacekeeping reputation is something great and something to uphold. But our reading is probably similar to Eve's, which is that peacekeeping in Canada is also Canadian peacekeeping has also been an imperialist endeavor. You mentioned Haiti, but also even back to the Belgian Congo situation. Patrice Lumumba, one of the prominent leaders, progressive leaders in the Congo, was handed over to be murdered by Canadian peacekeepers. Canadian peacekeeping has not been a sort of noble endeavor either.
And here I thought it was the CIA. I didn't know it was Canadian.
Oh well, no, I mean they worked.
I thought it was the CIA.
It was the CIA, but it was Canadian peacekeepers who sort of hunted him down and found him and handed him over to be murdered. And so the question about what are we facing internally? Well, a big thing is what's going to happen. Right now we have a program called CERB, which is sort of like a kind of a temporary basic income for people just because of the pandemic and job losses associated with it. That's set to run out pretty soon. So in some ways that was a program that was pushed for by unions, by the sort of left government here, and the Liberals did, to their credit, adopted it, although it tends to be something of a landlord subsidy. That's set to run out very soon. And in a lot of cities, I'm in Toronto right now, there's a backlog of evictions waiting, thousands of them waiting to go through. So in the crisis has been, the capitalist crisis, I think, is being pushed off for a little bit, but it's coming. So that's really what we're facing. And with that and everything that's been going on too, we have the crisis in policing, over policing, the racialized element to it. Again, like you'd mentioned, Keystone. There's lots of issues here as well with the pipelines being put through. There's I think we're probably set for something. Well, globally, I think the world and Canada won't be immune to it. Is set for something like the Great Depression that's going to be coming here soon. So so there's a big laundry list of problems. I guess I don't know. I can get more specific if you want.
But in your estimation, Jay, do you think capitalism, like the ideology or the economic system, has suffered at all in the kind of minds of Canadians? Is there any support for like socialist alternatives?
Yes, there is. Yeah, I'd say so. I think it tends to be generational. It's younger people and stuff who are more interested in socialism. Whether we in our party we have a very specific understanding of what that is, of scientific socialism. People generally, I think, don't hew to that idea, but they do see that capitalism isn't working. I think there's the polling is about 55% of people in Canada think that capitalism isn't working. They don't necessarily have an idea of what they want to replace it necessarily. But yeah, there is an understanding of that. Unfortunately, I'd say the left in Canada is quite weak, is quite small. The labor movement too has historically been attacked for a number of years and is not necessarily ready for the fight, unfortunately. So there's a lot of work to do, but I'd say in terms of people looking for alternatives, yeah, there's quite a bit of it going on. It's not represented at all in the media, I'd say, and I think actually this goes back to why Canadians have the view of the world that they do, and I'd say it's because of the media. We have a very concentrated media. It's a couple of corporations here that run everything, and a state broadcaster, the CBC, which traditionally was more liberal progressive, but now is definitely on board with some of the more egregious examples of Canadian foreign policy crimes. And unfortunately, this is something to say for the United States. Maybe it's just the size of the United States or whatever it is, but there is a serious alternative media in the United States that just simply doesn't exist in Canada. That magazine, Canadian Dimension, it's a good that you mentioned that Eve wrote the piece in. It's a good magazine. It's very small. There's not really any substantial alternative media. The labor unions fund an organization called Rabble. It's a very small outfit as well. It doesn't have that much reach at all. It's sort of, there's the Social Democratic Party, which we have, the NDP, which the United States doesn't have, but it's also, it's been a neoliberal party for quite a while, even though there are very many good people in that party. People consider themselves socialists. Yeah, that's very rambling.
I think what is really just, I don't know, kind of shocking to me listening to you talk about the concentration of media in Canada. I mean, it sounds like an echo of the United States. It seems like you guys have maybe a few more parties and like a bit more representation, and in general, I think like the infrastructure is not as ruthless as it is here,
Mm-hmm.
but it is set up in a way that is very similar. So I think, this conversation just makes me want to say, like, okay, beware,
Mm-hmm.
the people who are thinking, okay, well, if we just go to Canada. I mean, I think that Canada, even the immigration system is, it has that point system and everything, and it's not I don't think it is as brutal as it is here in the US, because it's just become systematically more just terrible here. It's an incarceration machine, and it's really cruel and it's dehumanizing. I don't know, but I mean, I know that in Canada it's like a point system and it's a little bit different, but uh, I just tell people like, you have to be aware of who your neighbor is too, and not be so quick, because personally I think Prime Minister Trudeau is a beautiful man, but he has not the best policies, and it's kind of like oh, they sold us this guy that seems amazing, but it's really not. So yeah, and speaking of that, actually, I wanted to make reference to this article that I just read, but it's from February 2020, and it's called "Canada is Fake." And what Americans think of as their friendly neighbor to the north, if they think of it at all, is a scam. I don't know if you had a chance to read it or if you heard anything about it. It was on the outline.com.
I haven't, but it's kind of like an ongoing internet phrase that Canadian leftists use, that Canada is fake. So I'm probably familiar with the gist of the arguments.
Interesting. Okay. So say more about that, because and just briefly for anybody that is listening to the podcast, uh, you definitely should read it, but it does talk about the extractive nature of
Mm-hmm.
Canada and how, over 75% of the world's mining companies are based in Canada, and the gross violation of sovereignty, territorial sovereignty of First Nations, and continuing practice of colonialism and accumulation. I'm just kind of like giving a summary using the words of this
Mm-hmm.
article, which is very good. And but I think that we use Canada as an example of like how to be, peaceful, and they don't have as many shootings, which is good. It's like it's crazy here. Um, but
No,
but
no, and before, sorry to interrupt, Vanessa, just real quick, before Jay gets a chance to digest all of this,
yeah.
also wanted to mention that he's making a very good point on his Twitter, and later we'll give his Twitter handle, that you're talking that Canada has an unelected Senate. So if you could integrate that answer or that explanation into your answer, we would really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Sure.
Why is it fake then? What Canada is fake? Okay, say
Uh,
more.
All right. Well, I don't tend to agree, but I get the point. There's an unfortunate, darkly material reality to Canada, but the joke is that Canada is actually an oil company, a mining company, and a racist RCMP officer, on each other's shoulders, wearing a trench coat that says Canada on it. But I mean, in terms of mining companies, it's a long, well, not. I'll try to keep it as brief as I can. Back in the 50s and 60s, there was basically only one mining company in Canada. I think it was the precursor to Rio Tinto, which was involved in Jamaica at the time as well. So there wasn't really much of a mining industry in Canada, which is strange given the amount of resources and minerals and stuff that are here. It was in the 1970s, I believe, under the first Trudeau government, Pierre Trudeau, the father of Justin Trudeau, that the Social Democratic Party, the NDP at the time, pushed for something they called Canadianization of mining, which was that they didn't want to nationalize the mining situation in Canada, but they wanted more Canadian mining companies. And so they created a whole tax structure and incentives for mining corporations to come up here and be headquartered in Toronto. That eventually expanded. Now they're in Toronto, they're in Calgary, they're in Vancouver. So it was actually sort of a long pseudo-progressive campaign by the government at the time to develop a Canadian mining industry. And now we see that they're internationally, I mean, people talk about the relationship between China and Africa, but Canada has more money from Canadian mining corporations in Africa. And, frankly, we don't build infrastructure. We don't do anything. It's a very extractive relationship. And that mirrors the relationship that Canada as a whole has had with Indigenous people since way before the founding of Canada. I mean, before Canada, there was something called the Hudson's Bay Company, which was sort of a royal that was set up by a private company, a monopoly corporation, but also set up and aided by the British government that basically settled Canada in the sense that we know. So Canada was actually a monopoly corporation before it was a country, which I think maybe could go into what it is today. And we still, this is an interesting point. So getting to the structure of Canada, ostensibly we're a constitutional monarchy, even though the constitution that was passed in 1982 and was supposed to supersede the British North American Act hasn't been ratified by all the provinces nor Indigenous nations. So the constitution is on way flimsier ground. I mean, the point that I was making, I think, was to compare the situation in Canada to Venezuela. And yeah, we have an unelected Senate. Up until recently, people were appointed to that Senate for life. Now it's still 75. So this is ridiculous. And that Senate, it can veto anything that comes from the House of Commons. This is an issue. If we did have a progressive government, there's so much stuff that the Canadian state and ruling class can put in front of it. That gets to the point too that the head of state of Canada is the Queen. The Queen Elizabeth. Her representative is a governor general. The governor general is the one who makes the election, makes the government. We vote. We don't. Unlike a republic, unlike the United States, even we don't directly vote for a prime minister or a president. We vote for parties, and then they're given the opportunity to build a government with the governor general's consent. So that's an issue too. If there's a progressive government, what is the governor general going to do? There's also another thing called a privy council. It's made up of all of the former cabinet ministers and a clerk from the civil service and other people. I believe the Prince of Wales is in it. It can make secret decisions. It can pass executive orders that nobody can see. People say all the time, "Oh, these things are just vestiges of the old colonial system." It's just traditional. They can't really do anything. But we know that this isn't the case at all. In Britain, they have a Privy Council as well, and it was vetoing legislation up until 4 or 5 years ago. In the 1970s in Australia, they elected a Labour government. The Labour government was more left leaning. It wanted to be part of a non-aligned movement. The Queen, through the Privy Council, used it to destroy that government. They had basically a slow motion coup. So there are all these things about how Canada operates that yeah, I guess could lead you to think that they're fake. Unfortunately, Canada is real and does real damage in the world. That's my opinion, anyways.
Wow. That just it's so absurd to think that these structures are still in place, and then a ton of these countries are going around and telling others how to do democracy. I think that is rich. So I do have one more question, and I think it's something it's controversial, but I think that we need to definitely involve men in this conversation, because I think that there is an issue of like a crisis in masculinity in the Western world. I don't know what's going on, but like something's happening, and I think that we might do one episode that just focuses on that. But the men's rights movement, and this is kind of a I don't know what turn in this conversation, but it was interesting because when I was in college, one of my friends went to study abroad in Canada, and he was like, singing the praises of Canada, and he was really happy. I think he had a really good time. I think he went to like University of Vancouver or something, and it was really good. Or no, University of Winnipeg, and it was really fun and all that stuff. And then he came back kind of being a little MRA-ish, but like being really conflicted about it, because he said, "Oh," and this was, I don't know, like 9 years ago, 10, yeah, like a bit, like almost it's gonna be like 10 years ago. And he was like saying that you couldn't even say the word bitch in Canada. Like it was like socially unacceptable to say this word, and all these other things. And he felt kind of limited in that sense. And then, fast forward to today, this issue is a festering problem of misogyny and just like all sorts of weird things that are coming up from this ideology. And I think that while there are some grievances that I think are something that we need to look at, for example, like in family courts, the rights of fathers, also something like rape in prison is a problem that disproportionately affects men, among other things that are truly, a men's rights issue, in which, feminists would join in that struggle if it were, more than just hollow words. But for me, what has been the most interesting thing is that a lot of this content from MRAs is coming from Canada, or like some of the thought leaders of this movement are in Canada. So is it a country that bans culturally bans the word bitch? If it's that, woke or whatever, but then that breeds, is it a breeding ground for this MRA movement? I mean, what are some of your thoughts, just kind of loosely, or whatever you want to say, about the state of the movement in Canada?
So okay, might be a long long story too as well. I'll try to keep it brief. So this goes back to the media concentration in Canada. So in the late 1980s, early 1990s, there was a guy named Conrad Black, he was in jail recently in the United States for violations of corporate finance laws. He was I think in the House of Lords in the U.S. He was a major, anyways, a sort of like traditional Anglo-Canadian wealthy guy, went to private school, et cetera, et cetera. He created a paper called the National Post in the 1990s, and basically it was to bring in to Canada a more hardline, reactionary, right-wing, style of thought. Because at the time there was the precursor to the Conservative Party, which is the party of Stephen Harper, was called the Progressive Conservatives. I guess they were maybe more traditionally what you could see as Tory. There was some people, who had ideas that they were basically soft conservatives at the sense. And in the 1990s, there was a big push to sort of redefine Canadian conservatism. And a lot of that had to do with this National Post newspaper, which put a lot of money into publishing really basically extreme far right opinions and sort of laundering them into the mainstream. So we have somebody like Mark Steyn, who is a notorious Islamophobe British guy. He was named in Anders Breivik, who was the shooter in Norway who killed all of those people at that camp. He was named in his manifesto as being an influence on him. David Frum, who was part of Bush's team, who wrote the Axis of Evil phrase, was part of that organization. Basically they put a lot of money into letting these people launder far right ideologies into the mainstream. And so we can see now, after 20, 30 years of that it's coming to fruit. So we have people like Jordan Peterson, who's here at the University of Toronto, or although I guess now he's somewhere in Serbia or something like that. But there is an infrastructure of that sort of men's rights stuff here in Canada. And its ability to grow has in some way, I guess, does kind of mirror what your friend experienced. Like, yeah, it is probably culturally unacceptable to say that word. That's not to say that Canada is a feminist paradise at all. No, but there have been sort of more progressive. I mean, we have a judiciary here, which I think has tended to be somewhat more progressive on certain issues, and that was a big thing for conservatives in the 90s. They hated that. In the States, the Supreme Court, I really don't get this. It seems like almost like a religion that they have about the Constitution, that it's you've got to discover the intent of the original founding fathers, et cetera, et cetera. In Canada, the judiciary doesn't tend to be like that, and so there have been some sort of more progressive things and laws passed, and maybe at the provincial level as well. So I think that those things, even as insufficient, and they did not definitely end sexism or create a feminist society, they led to a backlash, and that backlash was nurtured by by very wealthy people who had a newspaper that could put out these ideas. And when you have a newspaper in a small media ecosystem like Canada that has a lot of money, that is everywhere as a daily, it has a lot of influence. It's I guess it's like if the Times was when the New York Times says something or whatever, it has that influence too. And so this was in the National Post in Canada, and at the same time, this guy Conrad Black also owned all of these other smaller papers, and since then it's become basically the only media, Post Media, which is now the publisher, is basically one of the only large newspaper publishers in Canada. They in some cases in Vancouver, for example, they own both of the dailies. There's no real competition. So back 30 years ago, there was other papers that could compete with it, and now there's not really anything. There's the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail here in Toronto, but that's about it. So there really is this men's rights thing. It's tied into the hard conservative movement here. There's a lot of evangelical Christians who have seen what happened in the States with the moral majority, and sort of followed that. Even within the private sector, actually, the new Privy Council leader, who's the head of the civil service in Canada. He's involved in the evangelical church. They have like prayer meetings with people in the public sector. It's very strange. It's not even something that people, I think, in regular Canadian mainstream society think about too much. But there's a heavy and dark element of Canadian conservatism that has real power, intellectually and politically, I'd say. And I think that's where this sort of men's right movement gets its power from too. And they get a lot of money. I mean, frankly, there's billionaires who run oil and gas companies who fund things like that. In the last election, we had a party called the People's Party, which was basically a proto-fascist organization. It had one guy who defected, Maxime Bernier, from the other Conservative Party, because he felt that Conservative Party wasn't right-wing enough. It was basically straight out racist organization. It got incredible coverage in the media. At the same time, the election before, a smaller party had started. It had 2 MPs at the time, called Forces and Democracy. It was totally ignored. It was maybe like a soft sort of social democratic organization. Basically, there was 1 or 2 stories about this party that had seats in parliament, that was active, that was running other candidates, and people don't even remember it exists. But this People's Party, this far-right organization, which was funded by a racist billionaire, was getting coverage everywhere, was getting talked about, was getting demanded that they be put into the leadership debates. So there's the men's rights movement. It exists in Canada, I think, because it's funded and because it has a sort of media ecosystem here that can nurture it, that can push it out. Jordan Peterson gets published in the National Post, for example.
Yeah, no, yeah, go ahead.
And as we're unfortunately drawing to a close this interview, Jay, I just wanted to understand just one last comment from your side about, I mean, it looks like the Communist Party of Canada and just progressive forces in Canada really have a lot of work in front of them and just spaces to conquer, because the panorama is, I don't know, a little bit bleak, I think. But I just don't understand why the mainstream leadership of Canada just continues to follow just the U.S. lead, or even just right-wing forces in America, in the American continent. I mean, we've seen these videos of Trudeau just being completely ignored by Bolsonaro in these international meetings, and just how he's completely humiliated by Trump. I just don't understand why the Canadian political elites just continue to suck up to the U.S. in general, no matter how humiliated they get.
Well, I don't think it's an entirely settled thing, and I think you can see, unfortunately, not enough. You can see that there's some cracks in this sort of in this approach. For example, John Manley, who was the Foreign Affairs Minister under Chrétien and a Liberal, and a very prominent sort of businessman. He's on one of the larger economic councils here, which represents corporate Canada. He has been in smaller forums and here and there, like very, very critical of this approach. For example, when we renegotiated NAFTA to the USMCA, one of the clauses in it, which was totally ridiculous, I can't believe that Canada signed, was that the United States would have veto power over any future trade agreement that Canada or Mexico might have with a non-private economy, meaning basically China, but also it could include Vietnam or anything like that. And we agreed with it in Canada. And I think that this is a big bone of contention in within the Liberal Party and within even business circles too, who see that yes, that China is a growing power and that it's not necessarily in the best interest even of corporate Canada, of the ruling class, to go along with the United States. However, that being said, I think when it comes to the United States and it comes to their policy towards Latin America, that's fundamentally not going to change unless Canadians understand what's going on there and act against it. Because Canadian mining interests are very strong. In Haiti, I guess it was more an example of manufacturing of the Gildan t-shirt company and stuff like that. But also Canadian imperialist interests in the Caribbean too. I mean, it's been historically a place where Canadian finance capital goes to exploit and extract value from. Sorry. So the reason that they're going along with it, I think, is because that's Canadian corporate interests are best served by doing that. Unfortunately, that's the case. So it's gonna be a lot of hard work to expose what Canada's doing and to get people out in front of it. I think, I mean, even what happened in Bolivia, I think we know that Canadian mining companies were involved there. Unfortunately, there's no one in the media or anything like that who's doing the work. The NDP, which has nominally come out against it, hasn't done anything, hasn't asked the government in the House of Commons for any information about it. It doesn't seem to be doing anything. So yeah, so there's a lot of work to do.
Definitely. So yes, for all people interested, we highly recommend just to follow you on Twitter at Le Drapeau Rouge. That's horrible for my French. LEDRPEAU Rouge, ROUGE, and also you're the Central Organizing Communist Party of Canada, and also follow the Communist Party of Canada at Com Party Canada. We really recommend. I don't know, Vanessa, you have any closing thoughts?
I just wanted to say thank you once again to Jay for joining us today in this English language episode of Contraelite. I think that we got a pretty interesting and good different perspective of what's going on in Canada. And yeah, we definitely look forward to seeing what the audience thinks. And yeah, once again, just thank you for joining us today. If you want to follow the show, or the podcast rather, you can go on Twitter at Contraelite1 on Twitter and on Instagram. And yeah, we hope to see you all next time. Thank you so much. All right, let me